Hey, church family. Hope you're all doing well and staying safe and healthy. It's good to be with you again on this Wednesday as we get together for a little midweek Bible study and lesson. And speaking of this week's lesson, it's about a character and a story that's probably familiar to most, if not all of us, even if you don't know all the details. If you're like me, it's a story that you've heard probably since you were a child and throughout your childhood. But it's not just a children's story. It's not just for kids. It's also a story for us as adults as well. And it's a story for us as adults as well because it reminds us, I think, of some pretty important realities. For one, it reminds us that we can refuse to be defined and ruled by the unfairness that we may face in our lives or the adversity that we may go through. But it also reminds us that we can live productively even if we don't start so well, even if we start immaturely, and that we can choose to write our story based on our allegiance to God and how we finish our life's journey. And perhaps no one does this better and reminds us of this better in the Bible than our person who is today's and than the person who is today's focus for our lesson. Here's his story kind of in a nutshell. As a boy, he was a bit of a spoiled brat, if we're just being honest. Of course, his doting father didn't do him any favors because he kind of enabled this bratty behavior, which made his brothers resent him all the more. And even more than that, they detested his arrogance. I mean, he had the gall to tell his brothers his dreams of being their superior, and all the while he was oblivious to his petty arrogance. Eventually, they got so sick of it that they plotted to kill him. However, at the last minute, an older brother, in an effort to avoid having the murder of his bratty and favored brother on his hands, instead decided to sell him as a slave. Those slave traders then sold this boy into one of the most significant households in the world at the time, and he ended up growing in favor in that environment until his resistance to a sexual advance ended up landing him in prison. It seems, if you read his story, that no righteous deed he did went unpunished during this time and season in his life. Steadily, though, over time, he grew in favor in the jail with the jail keepers and his fellow inmates. And while one fellow prisoner forgot him when he was released from prison, another fellow prisoner did remember him, and he eventually returned to favor, this time in the eyes of the world's most prominent leader, when he prophesied and interpreted this leader's dreams. The leader of the land then placed him in charge of famine preparation that gave him great power and influence, and he ended up saving untold thousands of lives, and some of those lives happened to be his own family. In fact, even his brothers who had sold him into slavery. And now he was the second most powerful man in the land, and yet instead of returning their deeds, his brothers' deeds toward him with vengeance and revenge, he forgave his brothers and brought them into this new land to live with him, just as it had been prophesied years earlier. And this seemingly happy ending to such a horrible beginning, well, it eventually took a dreadful turn years later, but then that's the beginning of another story and another leader that we'll have to save for another time. Basically, if you recognize some of the details, that's the very short version of the story of Joseph in the book of Genesis. By the way, the story of Joseph is actually the longest in the Bible outside of the Gospels retelling, or telling, I should say, the story of Jesus. And through all the intrigues and the twists and the turns and the challenges in Joseph's personal story, one thing remained true of Joseph. He remained faithful to the compassion and the character of God. And Joseph's three virtues, faithfulness, righteous character, and gracious compassion, those are the characteristics of God throughout his dealings with his people. And they are the same virtues and characteristics that God desires for his own people to display in their lives, just like Joseph. God wants his people to be like him in who they are and what they do. And you think about Joseph's life from the moment that he was sold into slavery until the day he forgave and saved his brothers, and really throughout his life, Joseph consistently lived these characteristics of God. No matter the circumstances, Joseph was faithful. No matter the temptation, Joseph maintained his righteous character. And in the face of some horrible situations, Joseph practiced gracious compassion toward those around him. As God promised to Abraham all the way back in Genesis chapter 12, God blesses those who maintain faithfulness, righteous character, and gracious compassion. And he blesses those who bless them, and even more, he blesses the world through their actions. And Joseph is a reminder of God's great promise. So, what about you? Maybe like Joseph, you didn't start your story too well. Maybe your life has been derailed and your relationships have been derailed by poor choices. Maybe they were others' choices. Maybe they were your own choices. Or maybe they were because of pride and arrogance in your life. Or maybe you started off well. Maybe you weren't like Joseph. You did start off well, but it's kind of been downhill ever since. Wherever you are, wherever you've been, whatever you've done, while we all want to start our story off well and continue in that, Joseph is a reminder that no matter where we are, or who we are, or what we've done, or where we've been, or even what's been done to us, we can rewrite our story. Our circumstances don't have to define us, but our allegiance to God can. And even when we fall short in portions of our story to the person we want to be and the person God has called us to be, our faithfulness to be a person who reflects God's values and nature, his gracious compassion, and his righteous character can lead us and many others because of us to be blessed by God, no matter how we started. Your story, our stories matter to God. We might never be in the same position to change the world like Joseph was and did, but we are all in a place to be able to bless the lives of those around us. And as we find our story caught up into God's great story, let's choose to be someone like Joseph. Let's choose to change our world for the better rather than having our values eroded and defined by our circumstances and our surroundings. The Apostle Paul says this in Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2, and this is from the Message translation. He says, "So here's what I want you to do, God helping you. Take your everyday, ordinary life, your sleeping, eating, going to work, and walking around life, and place it before God as an offering. Embracing what God does for you is the best thing you can do for him. Don't become so well adjusted to your culture," I like that you fit into it without even thinking. Instead, fix your attention on God. You'll be changed from the inside out. Readily recognize what he wants from you and quickly respond to it. Unlike the culture around you always dragging you down to its level of immaturity, God brings out the best of you to develop well-formed maturity in you. So like Joseph, let's be God's people, living out God's plan of blessing no matter our circumstances, no matter our situation, as we continue down the road in our journey of redemption, and hopefully helping others in their journey of redemption as well. Hope you have a blessed day. God bless.